crimson button, a silent scream, and a trail that even Scotland Yard fears to follow. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me, detective, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your words make this mystery come alive. Let's uncover the truth. It was a grey and clammy afternoon in early November, the sort of day when the very stones of Baker Street seemed to weep with the damp, and even the fire in our hearth offered little warmth against the encroaching chill. I was sitting in my usual chair near the window, leafing through the Lancet, when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, knocked and entered with her habitual discretion. "There is a lady to see Mr. Holmes, sir," she announced softly. "Quite agitated, poor thing. Says it's a matter of life and death." Holmes, who had been lounging on the settee with his fingertips pressed together and eyes closed in what I knew was far from slumber, opened one eye. "Show her in, Mrs. Hudson," he murmured. "And please, a pot of tea. I suspect our visitor may be in need of it." Moments later, the door opened again and admitted a striking woman clad in deep mourning, her black crepe veil clinging to her features, though it did little to conceal the tension etched into every line of her pale face. She was perhaps in her late 20s, well dressed, but not ostentatiously so, and carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to society but now utterly unmoored by grief. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling but clear, "I am Beatrice Dunsmore. I fear something terrible has happened to my brother, and I am told you are the only man in London who may find the truth." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Please be seated, Miss Dunsmore. Your brother, he is dead?" "Yes." "Sir Lionel Dunsmore was found yesterday morning in the conservatory of our family estate, Dunsmore Hall in Surrey. He had been stabbed once, cleanly, through the heart. The local constabulary believe it was a burglary gone wrong, but She faltered, eyes darting between Holmes and myself. "I know that is not true." Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes sharpening. "And why do you believe that, Miss Dunsmore?" "Because nothing was taken. The house was untouched, the doors locked, and most importantly—" She paused, reached into her small leather handbag, and withdrew a tiny object wrapped in linen. This was found clutched in his left hand. She placed it gently on the table. Holmes carefully unwrapped the linen to reveal a single crimson button. It was small, no larger than a coin, but vividly dyed and of an unusual design. Etched around its rim in tiny lettering were what appeared to be initials. CVD. Watson leaned in. "Curious? It seems too fine to belong to a servant." Holmes said nothing at first. He picked up the button with a pair of tweezers and examined it under his lens. "Silk threaded," he muttered. "French make, hand dyed. And the initials engraved, not stamped. This button was custom made. Whoever lost it did not wear mass-produced clothing." Beatrice Dunsmore sat forward. "You see, Mr. Holmes, Lionel was not the sort of man to be caught unawares. He was a former military officer, guarded, disciplined, and there was no sign of forced entry." Holmes tapped the button against his palm thoughtfully. "Tell me, Miss Dunsmore, who was staying in the house at the time?" "Just the family. Myself. My cousin Victor Dunsmore, who has been living with us since returning from India, and Miss Genevieve Martin, my brother's fiancée. The servants were asleep in the east wing. They heard nothing." Holmes rose and began to pace, the button still in his hand. "CVD," he murmured again. "A coincidence, perhaps? Victor Dunsmore?" Beatrice started. "Surely not. Victor loved Lionel. They were raised almost as brothers." "Quite so. Yet buttons do not leap into the hands of dead men without motive or method." He turned to me. "Watson, pack your bag. We shall depart for Surrey this evening. I wish to see this conservatory by lantern light. before the servants can be persuaded to tidy away a single leaf. And the police? I asked. We shall allow Inspector Lestrade to catch up when he can. If the matter is as curious as I suspect, it may do him good to be a step behind for once. Miss Dunsmore looked between us with a fragile glimmer of hope in her eyes. You will take the case, Mr. Holmes? Holmes bowed slightly. Miss Dunsmore, I rarely take cases of ordinary murder, but a crimson button and a locked house offer just the right perfume of peculiarity. Yes, we are engaged. The train journey to Surrey passed in a silence laden with unspoken questions. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled and his gaze fixed on the darkening countryside, now slipping past the window in a blur of hedgerows and damp fields. The button rested safely in his coat pocket, its presence as ominous and curious as the crime it had accompanied. I had known Holmes long enough to read the signs. His mind was already fully engaged, running possibilities, rejecting irrelevancies, and weighing probabilities like a chemist distilling essence from raw substance. I knew better than to interrupt. My own thoughts circled around the Dunsmore woman's grim tale, and I found myself wondering just what sort of household we were about to enter. We arrived at the village of Halberton just after 7 o'clock. A carriage awaited us at the station, its oil lamps casting flickering halos on the cobbled approach. Miss Dunsmore sat inside, still clad in mourning, her face drawn but composed. I thank you for coming so quickly, she said as we set off. I have spoken to the housekeeper and instructed that the conservatory remain untouched, just as you asked. Holmes inclined his head. Excellent. Details, Miss Dunsmore, those that seem too small to mention.
When we spoke earlier, were there any quarrels, disputes among the guests? Not to my knowledge, she replied. Lionel had been in excellent spirits the evening before. We dined together, the four of us, at 7. Afterwards, he played a duet with Genevieve in the music room while Victor and I played a round of chess. Lionel retired early, around 10. He said he had correspondence to finish. Correspondence? Holmes's voice was sharp with interest. Yes. He had received a letter from a solicitor earlier that day, something to do with an old family estate near Brighton that's being auctioned. Do you know what became of that letter? She shook her head. It must be among his papers, though I haven't had the courage to search his desk. Holmes nodded, filing the information away. The carriage turned onto a long gravel drive flanked by withered hedges. Dunsmore Hall loomed ahead, an imposing Georgian structure, its windows glimmering with amber light behind misted panes. A crescent moon had risen above the trees, casting pale light across the estate's sloping lawns and glass-roofed conservatory. The butler, a sombre man named Merton, greeted us at the door and led us through panelled corridors to the drawing-room, where 2 of the house's remaining occupants awaited us. Victor Dunsmore rose to greet us with a brisk nod. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a military moustache and the leathery tan of someone recently returned from warmer climates. There was a guarded look in his eye, but no evident hostility. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said. "A damned tragedy, this. Lionel was like a brother to me." "Indeed," Holmes replied neutrally. "And Miss Martin?" The second figure turned as we approached. Genevieve Martin was beautiful in the continental way, delicate features, a cascade of chestnut curls, and a bearing of unstudied grace. Her eyes, however, were watchful, not fearful, but measured. "I understand you were engaged to Sir Lionel," Holmes said after introductions had been made. "Yes." Her voice was low and refined. We had only recently made it official. He intended to announce it publicly after Christmas. "And how did you find Sir Lionel the night before his death?" "We practiced together on the pianoforte," she replied. He was cheerful, lively. He joked that I would one day grow weary of his devotion to order and punctuality. Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Order and punctuality? A man of habits, then?" "Extremely so," Victor interjected. "Lionel ran the house like a regiment. Letters written at precisely the same hour each day, meals never a minute late. He liked his surroundings. Predictable." Holmes gave a faint nod, then turned to Merton. "The conservatory, if you please." Lantern in hand, the butler led us down a narrow corridor that terminated in a pair of frosted glass doors. He opened them and stepped back to let us through. The conservatory was silent, save for the distant ticking of a mantel clock and the occasional creak of shifting glass overhead. The air smelled faintly of soil and decay. Ferns and orchids loomed in iron pots, their leaves drooping in sorrowful tribute. In the centre of the space was a wicker chaise longue, beside which a dark stain still marked the tiled floor. "Sir Lionel was found there," Merton said, gesturing, "slumped on the settee, holding that strange button." Holmes knelt, examining the scene with the intensity of a jeweller appraising a diamond. He moved with fluid precision, glancing at the stain, the nearby foliage, the pattern of crushed tiles underfoot. He held the lantern low to the floor and tilted it, watching for glints. "Where is the entrance to the conservatory?" "Just here," Merton replied, pointing to a narrow exterior door. Holmes tried the handle. "Locked?" "Yes, sir. From the inside." The key was in Sir Lionel's pocket. Holmes gave no reply. He moved to the side of the room, examining the panes above. At one point he paused, stood on tiptoe, and examined the sill with his magnifying glass. "Watson," he said quietly, beckoning me over. "Observe this smudge. What do you make of it?" I peered closer. There was indeed a mark, faint, almost invisible, a half-moon-shaped smear just below the iron catch. "Grease," I guessed. "Pomade," he murmured, from a head recently pressed against the pane. Someone looked in or looked out, very closely, and very recently. He moved again, this time examining the soil under the pots. At one point he pulled a sliver of something from beneath a fern pot and held it up to the lantern. "A thread of lace," he murmured, slipping it into an envelope. Satisfied at last, he rose. "Come, Watson, let us examine the study." We were led upstairs to a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a mahogany desk. Holmes approached it with the caution of a man approaching a sleeping animal. He opened drawers carefully, inspecting the contents, but disturbing nothing. After several minutes, he located a small bundle of letters tied with string and flicked through them quickly. "Here," he said, holding up a sheet. "The solicitor's letter, but look, dated 2 days prior to his death, and unopened." I frowned. "Miss Dunsmore said he received it that morning." "Quite. So why was it unopened? And more curiously, why did he lie about it?" He tapped the envelope thoughtfully, then turned to the fire grate. He bent, reaching in with a pair of tongs, and drew out a corner of scorched paper. "There was something else he did read," he said. "Something he then attempted to destroy." He placed the fragment on the desk. There were a few visible letters, "Be meet at 11, not before," and a series of initials. "CVD." Holmes turned to me, his expression sharpening with focus. "The button was no accident, and the initials are not a—"
Coincidence? But that would suggest, Victor? Not necessarily, but we are closer to the truth than we were. Much closer. Just then a knock came at the door. Miss Dunsmore entered, her face pale. "There's something you must see," she said. "In Lionel's wardrobe. It was hidden in the lining of his greatcoat." She held up a small leather case. Inside nestled in velvet, was a single antique key, long, ornate, and marked with the number 7. Holmes took it gently and stared at it for several seconds. "A key," he whispered. "But to what door?" He turned to me with a glint in his eye. "We are no longer chasing shadows, Watson. The crime is no longer obscure, it is merely incomplete." Holmes spent the remainder of the evening in a state of intense abstraction. After our examination of the conservatory and the discovery of the charred letter fragment and mysterious key, we took a light supper with the family, though Holmes consumed nothing and spoke even less. I observed him watching each person with that quiet, piercing attention that made more than one guest falter under his gaze. Genevieve Martin, poised as ever, maintained an air of courteous sorrow, but there was a tension in her voice whenever Victor Dunsmore spoke. Victor, by contrast, was brusque, fidgeting with his wine-glass and volunteering pointed anecdotes about Lionel's rigid sense of justice that seemed out of place at the dinner table. Beatrice said little, her eyes flicking between Holmes and the others, as if she, too, was seeking answers. After the meal, Holmes excused himself with the faintest apology, requesting that the key be left with him overnight. Miss Dunsmore agreed, and we retired to a modest guest suite on the second floor, our trunks having arrived earlier. Holmes spread the contents of his pocket out on the desk. The crimson button, the singed paper fragment, the lace thread, and now the key. He stood over them in silence for nearly half an hour, broken only by the scratching of his pencil as he filled a page in his notebook with tiny, precise symbols. "Holmes," I ventured at last, "this key, could it belong to a strong-box, a bureau?" He didn't look up. "Unlikely. It is far older in design. See the bit, it's broad and single-notched. Of the kind used in early Georgian locks, not for furniture, more likely for a cellar or a private study, perhaps even an outbuilding. The number 7 suggests it's part of a set, perhaps once used in an inn or a private institution. But then why would Sir Lionel have it concealed in his coat?" "That is the correct question, Watson. Why would a man of exacting habits who did not permit a single misplaced item in his household keep a mystery key hidden in the lining of a garment he rarely wore?" He turned and faced me, the firelight dancing in his grey eyes. "There is something at the heart of this case that has yet to declare itself. The button, the smudge."
On the conservatory glass, the discarded letter, they are not accidents, they are footprints. Of the murderer? Holmes gave a ghost of a smile. Of the motive, but tomorrow we will walk those paths more directly. He then bade me good night, though I suspect he did not sleep. In the morning, after a swift breakfast, Holmes summoned Miss Dunsmore and asked to examine the entirety of Sir Lionel's wardrobe, especially outerwear. She complied at once, and we soon found ourselves in the late baronet's dressing-room, where his possessions had been meticulously preserved. Holmes examined each coat and jacket with care, pressing seams, tugging at linings, even unscrewing coat-hooks from the wall in search of hidden recesses. At last, in the inside pocket of a heavy winter cloak, he found a folded slip of paper. "This was not here yesterday," Miss Dunsmore said, frowning. "I looked through everything after the police left." Holmes opened the slip. It was a telegram dated the evening before Sir Lionel's death. "To Sir Lionel Dunsmore. From GM, meet me in the conservatory, 11 p.m. Urgent, come alone." The initials were unmistakable. "Genevieve Martin," I murmured. Holmes folded the note and slipped it into his coat. "We shall ask her directly." We found Miss Martin in the morning room, sketching absently at a table overlooking the eastern garden. She received us calmly, though her pencil stilled in her hand when Holmes presented the telegram. "I won't insult your intelligence," she said after a pause. "Yes, I sent that." "To what end, Miss Martin?" I needed to speak with Lionel privately. I suspected he had received a letter that morning from my father. Holmes's brow lifted slightly. Your father? Yes. He disapproved of our engagement deeply. I feared he might have said something to Lionel, perhaps tried to buy him off. I asked Lionel to meet me late after everyone had gone to bed, but he never came. You waited for him? She hesitated, then nodded. I waited in the garden, not inside the conservatory. I never saw him. You did not go in? No, I thought better of it and returned to my room. Yet he did go in, Holmes said softly. She flushed. I don't know why, perhaps he mistook my meaning. Holmes gave no sign of belief or disbelief. He simply thanked her and moved on. As we walked back toward the hall, he turned to me. She's lying, of course. You're sure? She was inside, the lace thread beneath the fern pot, lace such as the trim on the cuffs of her morning gown, and she is not the only one. Victor Dunsmore met us in the hallway with a curious look. I suppose you've uncovered more of my cousin's habits, he asked. Indeed, Holmes replied genially. I wonder, has anyone in the household made use of the eastern cellar recently? Victor blinked. No one. It's been locked for years. Does it have a
number? He shrugged. There were once guest rooms in that wing. Long ago. The keys are still labelled. I believe the cellar was number 7. Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. May we see it? With visible reluctance, Victor agreed, and we descended a narrow staircase into the older part of the estate. At the far end of a brick corridor, we reached a heavy oak door with iron bands, and on its tarnished brass plate, the number 7. Holmes fitted the key into the lock. With a creak, it turned. The door swung open. Inside, dust motes danced in a beam of lantern light. The room had clearly been unused for years, yet a recent disturbance was evident. A trail in the dust led to a battered trunk near the back wall. Holmes approached it slowly, then knelt and lifted the lid. Inside were bundles of old documents, a rolled tapestry, and, most startling of all, a velvet pouch containing a collection of antique buttons, each a different colour and design. One space in the velvet lining was empty. Holmes held the pouch aloft, and from his coat drew the crimson button. It fit the empty slot perfectly. Curious, I said. But what does it mean? He was silent, examining the documents in the trunk. Many were yellowed property records, but among them he found a sealed letter addressed to CVD Victor, standing behind us, made a sound halfway between a laugh and a scoff. Well, I'll be damned. You recognize it? Holmes asked. It's my father's hand, Charles Vernon Dunsmore. He died 10 years ago. What's that doing here? Holmes turned the envelope over. The wax seal had been broken. He read silently, then looked up. This letter changes the complexion of the case entirely. How so? He did not reply immediately, but his expression was grave. Because it makes clear that Sir Lionel had discovered something he was never meant to find, and someone in this house feared what he would do with it. A creak sounded behind us. We turned, and Miss Dunsmore stood in the doorway, her face ashen. You must read the rest, she said quietly, before someone else tries to stop you. Holmes looked at her, and for once there was something almost gentle in his gaze. I intend to, he said. Then he turned back to the chest and began to sort the papers within, while upstairs the house above seemed to hold its breath. Holmes worked through the documents in silence, the flickering lantern casting deep shadows across the dust-covered stone walls of the cellar. I stood to the side, watching him with a growing sense of unease. There was something heavy in the atmosphere, not merely the age of the room or the weight of forgotten paper, but a sense that we were standing on the edge of something long concealed and recently disturbed. Miss Dunsmore remained at the doorway, pale and still. She made no move to assist or interrupt, her eyes fixed on the letter Holmes had just unearthed. Victor had retreated.
Few paces behind her, arms folded tightly across his chest. Holmes at last spoke, not looking up. "These are family records, deeds, letters, a will, I believe, unsigned. But what matters, Watson, is this." He rose and handed me a half-folded document, brittle and faded with age. The ink had blurred in places, but the words were legible enough. "To my son, Charles Vernon Dunsmore, I leave the full record of the estate's affairs, including the truth about the holdings at Chilcombe Moor. You will find therein evidence of the debts incurred and the agreement signed with the Martin family to absolve them. This must remain hidden to protect the family name." Holmes withdrew another letter, its ink fresher. "Sir Lionel, you were never meant to find this. The agreement between your father and mine was buried with good reason. If this reaches light, neither of us can remain untouched. I beg you, destroy it, for your own sake and for Beatrice's." "Gee, Genevieve," I looked up sharply. "Then this wasn't just about inheritance or jealousy, it was blackmail." "Not in the legal sense," Holmes replied, "but emotional leverage, certainly. Sir Lionel stumbled upon a decades-old arrangement, one implicating both families. It seems the Martins and the Dunsmores have been bound by more than courtship." Victor's voice, sharp and uneven, cut through the silence. "That can't be. My father would never—" Holmes turned. "Your father was in debt. The documents show it plainly. He borrowed heavily against land he no longer owned and then, by arrangement, married the debt away. The Martins were compensated with influence, and when Lionel found the truth, he became a threat to the entire fiction." Victor stared at him, then at Beatrice, who had not moved or spoken since arriving. She spoke now, her voice so low we almost missed it. "I think he meant to end the engagement." Holmes raised a brow. "You believe he told Genevieve?" Beatrice nodded, eyes downcast. "He'd been quiet for days, withdrawn. And he asked me 2 nights before he died what I would think if Genevieve were to leave." "Did she know he had found these documents?" "I don't know, but she was upset. I overheard them arguing the morning of his death. Not shouting, but intense. She was crying. He told her something was too rotten to continue. I assumed it was the engagement." Holmes crossed to the pouch of buttons and held it up. "And this?" She hesitated again. "I've seen it before, years ago. It belonged to Victor's father. He kept it in his study. Each button came from a family heirloom. Some had histories, gifts from dignitaries, one supposedly from the court of Napoleon. He showed them to us as children." Holmes nodded slowly. "One button missing? The crimson one? The one Lionel clutched in death?" Victor took a step forward. "But why? Why that button?" "Because it was a signal," Holmes replied, "or a keepsake. Either it was planted to point us toward the truth, or Lionel took it from this chest to indicate what he'd found. In either case, it links the death directly to someone who knew of this box." He looked at both of them, which is a very short list. Back in the main part of the house, the atmosphere had grown tense. Word of our discovery, though not the details, had clearly spread. Genevieve was nowhere to be found, and the staff had retreated to corners of silence. Holmes requested that Merton, the butler, assemble everyone in the drawing-room. By late afternoon, we stood before the assembled household. Holmes, commanding the room with effortless authority, produced the crimson button and held it up. "This button," he began, "was found in Sir Lionel's hand. It came from a private family collection, hidden in a sealed cellar, one whose key he had concealed in his greatcoat." He allowed the silence to grow thick. "There are two possible interpretations. Either Lionel sought to draw attention to the secrets buried in that room, or someone who feared exposure planted it to lead us astray. Both possibilities point toward knowledge of that key and that chest, and thus toward motive." All eyes turned to Genevieve, who had slipped quietly into the room a moment before. She stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Holmes's tone remained calm. "Miss Martin, I believe you were in the conservatory that night." She began, but he raised a hand. "You sent the telegram, you admitted as much. Yet you claimed not to enter the room. And yet a thread of your lace was found beneath the fern pot. That would not happen unless you had hidden there, perhaps in fear or shame." Her mouth opened again, but no words came. "You went to meet him, and he told you he had discovered the secret. Perhaps he said the engagement was off. Perhaps he demanded you come forward with him. Either way, the confrontation did not go as you intended." "No," she said sharply, stepping forward. "You're wrong. I didn't kill him." Holmes was unmoved. "You may not have intended to, but something occurred. A push, a struggle. Sir Lionel stabbed swiftly and cleanly, and then you ran. Perhaps you realized what he had in his hand only later. Perhaps you returned, found him dead, the button clutched there, and panicked." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. Beatrice broke the silence. "Genevieve, please, tell them." Her shoulders sagged. She looked not at Holmes, but at Victor. "It wasn't me," she whispered. "It was your father." The room froze. "I found the papers a week ago," she said. "In the study. I read them. I confronted Lionel. He was devastated. He said he had to make it right, that he couldn't marry me under a lie. I told him if he exposed the deal, it would ruin both our families. I left him in tears." Victor stared at her. "What does that have to do with my father? He's dead." Genevieve's eyes flashed with sudden intensity. "Not the past, the letter, the one in the fire grate. It wasn't from me. I never wrote anything to him that night." Holmes stepped forward. "And yet it bore your initials." "I never signed with my initials. I always wrote G or nothing at all. That letter, someone else signed it." Holmes gave a soft exhalation. "Of course," he said. "CVD, Charles Vernon Dunsmore. He forged the letter using initials that could be mistaken for yours, but he's been dead 10 years. Beatrice spoke, her voice dry with disbelief. "Then who?" Victor's expression changed. Confusion first, then something darker. Holmes turned to him. "You kept your father's papers. You maintained his collection. You knew about the chest, the key, the old secrets. Tell me, did you find the letter long ago, or did you forge it yourself?" Victor took a step back. "You're mad." But Holmes was already turning to Merton. "Send for Inspector Lestrade. Mr. Dunsmore will remain under guard until we conclude our investigation." Victor's mask broke. "You can't prove anything." Holmes looked at him coldly. "You forged the letter to lure Lionel to the conservatory. You feared he would destroy the arrangement your father made, perhaps even disinherit you in favor of a more honest legacy. But you were sloppy. You used the crimson button as a threat, or left it behind, and then you tried to burn the evidence." Victor surged forward, but Holmes stepped calmly aside as Watson and the footman intercepted him. The moment was brief. He struggled once, then went still. Genevieve collapsed into a chair, sobbing softly. Beatrice sat beside her, equally shaken. Holmes turned away from the scene, his face unreadable. In the hallway, I caught up to him. You suspected him for some time? I suspected someone who feared what Lionel had found, that narrowed the field quickly. And the rest? Holmes glanced at me with a tired smile. Watson, when a man clings to a legacy built on falsehood, he will do anything to preserve it, even kill his own cousin who dared to speak the truth. We said nothing more as the fog settled over the hall once again, silent witness to the secrets it had harboured far too long. The following morning dawned bleak and wind swept, as if the weather itself had turned against Dunsmore Hall. The leaden skies seemed determined to press their weight upon the house, and the wind howled down the chimneys like a soul in protest. Holmes and I breakfasted in silence, the gravity of the previous day's events not yet having released their grip upon the household. Victor Dunsmore remained confined to his quarters under the quiet watch of a burly local constable summoned by Lestrade, who was due to arrive that afternoon. Despite the mounting evidence, Holmes had not pronounced the case closed. His manner remained pensive, even distracted. He had taken the crimson button from his pocket once more and was turning it over in his fingers at the breakfast table with the same delicate scrutiny as one might give a rare gem. "I suppose," I offered, "that it was Victor all along. The forged note, the motive, the opportunity. The evidence seems damning." Holmes did not immediately answer. He rose instead, buttoned his coat, and gestured toward the hallway. "Come, Watson, there's something still amiss." He led me not to the conservatory nor to the study or cellar, but to the rear of the estate, a narrow, disused corridor off the east wing I had scarcely noticed before. At its end was a stair, steep and creaking, that descended to what must once have been servant quarters or storage rooms. "I found a discrepancy last night," he said quietly as we descended. "You remember the grease smudge on the conservatory pane?" "Of course. You said someone had looked in or out." "Precisely. But the exterior of the conservatory faces the garden. No path leads directly to that window. One must trudge across a muddy patch of grass to reach it. And yet I found no footprints, no crushed grass, no sign of any passage." I frowned. "Then how was it made?" "That is what we are here to determine." At the bottom of the stairs, we emerged into a small chamber with a low ceiling and whitewashed walls. The air smelled of damp wood and disuse. Holmes scanned the room quickly and then moved to a wooden cupboard on the far wall. He tested the frame and gave a satisfied grunt. "Help me with this." Together we pulled the heavy cupboard aside, revealing a recess in the wall. Behind it, half hidden in shadow, was a door. Holmes tried the handle. It moved. The door creaked open to reveal a low tunnel lined with stone, barely tall enough for us to pass through, without stooping. "A servant's passage," I breathed. "But where does it lead?" "Let us find out." We followed the tunnel for 20 paces before it rose sharply and ended at a small trapdoor. Holmes pressed upward, and we emerged astonishingly into the rear of the conservatory behind a dense cluster of hanging ferns. "Well," Holmes said softly, brushing dust from his sleeves, "that explains our smudge. The murderer did not come through the house or the garden. He came from below." I stared at the passage behind us in mute astonishment. So he used this tunnel to enter the conservatory, kill Lionel, and vanish without a trace. Holmes's eyes glittered. "No, he lured Lionel here, then confronted him, possibly even under the pretense of an urgent meeting. But something else happened that night, Watson, something subtle and dangerously clever." We spent the next hour inspecting the tunnel and its entrances. Holmes found a muddy scuff mark on the stair that matched the tread of Victor Dunsmore's boots. A strong confirmation, but Holmes still did not seem content. Back upstairs, the house had stirred into cautious activity. Beatrice was taking tea in the drawing-room, and Genevieve, though composed, had not emerged since breakfast. Holmes, however, asked to speak with Merton, the butler. The old man arrived within minutes, polite but tight-lipped. "Merton," Holmes said gently, "how long have you served this family?" 31 years, sir." "Then you likely knew Charles Vernon Dunsmore better than most." "I did, sir." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Tell me, was there any history between him and Miss Martin's father?" The butler looked surprised. "They were not friends, sir. They had dealings, but they rarely spoke face to face. Mr. Dunsmore always said he preferred to manage such affairs through correspondence." Holmes nodded slowly. "And was he a man of sentiment?" "Not particularly. Strict, quiet." Holmes reached into his coat and produced the button. "This belonged to him, yes?" Merton peered at it. "Yes, sir. He was quite proud of that set." "Did he ever give one away?" Merton frowned, hesitating. "Once, I believe. To a guest. I can't recall who, years ago, sir, but I do remember him saying that the crimson button was meant to be a symbol of trust." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Trust." He thanked Merton and dismissed him. Then he turned to me, his manner suddenly urgent. "Watson, come with me. We must speak to Genevieve now." We found her in her chamber, seated beside the window. She rose when we entered, stiff-backed but unafraid. "Miss Martin," Holmes began, "I need you to answer one final question." She nodded slowly. "Did Victor ever give you anything from his father? A keepsake? A token?" She seemed taken aback. "No, I don't believe so." "Think carefully." Her brow furrowed. "Wait, there was a brooch, a small pin made from a button. Crimson, with initials. Victor gave it to me the first year we met. He said it was old, from his father's collection." Holmes turned away, lips drawn into a thin line. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. He faced us both, his voice now level and low. "Victor didn't keep that button as a threat. He gave it away long ago. It was in Miss Martin's possession until recently. I believe it was she who placed it in Lionel's hand." Genevieve paled. "No, why would I—" "To mislead, to make us believe the motive was family legacy, to point the finger at Victor, because the truth is more complex." He stepped closer. "You did not kill Lionel. You found him already dying. You saw the letter fragment in the grate. And then, in panic or calculation, you placed that button in his hand to mislead us, and to hurt the man who had betrayed both you and your family." She sank slowly into a chair, her face crumpling with exhaustion. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. "Lionel was cold, still. I saw the fire, saw what he'd tried to destroy. I thought Victor had done it. I truly did, and I wanted someone to pay for what was taken from me." Holmes sat across from her. "You must tell Lestrade everything. The half-truths you told yesterday nearly allowed a murderer to go free." Tears tracked silently down her cheeks, but she nodded. It was late afternoon when Inspector Lestrade arrived, huffing and grumbling as usual, but sufficiently impressed when Holmes recounted the chain of evidence, the hidden passage, and the confession. Victor Dunsmore was taken into custody without further protest. As he was led away, he passed Beatrice in the hall. Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them. Regret, perhaps, or something darker. We stood on the gravel path as the police wagon rolled away into the dusk. Holmes lit his pipe and exhaled a long stream of smoke. "You were right," I said at last. "It wasn't so simple." "No, Watson," he replied. "Cases of inheritance never are. Family secrets are like roots beneath the surface. Tug on one, and you risk bringing down the whole tree." I watched the last of the constables disappear down the lane and turned back to the house, And now? Now, said Holmes, brushing ash from his coat. We dine. I believe Mrs. Hudson has sent up a hamper. And after that, London, there is always another case. But I confess, he smiled faintly, I shall not soon forget the case of the Crimson Button. Nor, I suspect, would any of us who had walked the halls of Dunsmore Hall, where old debts and buried truths had finally and fatally come to light. We departed Dunsmore Hall the following morning under a sky of indifferent grey, the countryside rolling past our carriage windows in solemn silence. Beatrice had seen us off with gratitude, though it was the sort of gratitude that carried weight, of mourning, of betrayal, of things forever altered. Holmes, who had refused a second cup of tea in favour of pacing the foyer, was finally still as we rode, his gaze fixed on the landscape, yet clearly seeing nothing beyond the contours of his own mind. I had seen him thus before, deep in the coils of reflection, even after a case had seemingly concluded. And I, as always, could not let it rest so easily. Holmes, I ventured, the case is solved. Victor Dunsmore lured his cousin to the conservatory, used the servant's passage to enter unseen, and stabbed him. Genevieve, in her shock and confusion, muddied the scene with that cursed button. What more remains? Holmes did not answer at first. His hand rested on the brim of his hat, fingers tapping in an irregular rhythm. Then he spoke, slowly. Cases of this kind, Watson, never resolve themselves in straight lines. Motives compound. The original crime may be simple, but it is often shaded by the reactions of those who discover it. I frowned. You still believe there's something unfinished? He glanced at me sidelong. I believe there's a question we failed to ask. I waited. Why, he said softly, did Sir Lionel go alone to the conservatory without a weapon, without alerting a single servant, at nearly midnight, in answer to a note from someone he no longer trusted? But he thought it was from Genevieve. He had just argued with her, was on the verge of ending their engagement. He had discovered the truth about the family's dealings, truth he knew implicated her as well. Why would he answer a note signed GM without suspicion? Then, you believe he knew? I believe he knew the letter was not from Genevieve, and he went anyway. I said nothing for a long moment, trying to make sense of that. Then, slowly, I began to see his meaning. You think he expected to meet someone else? Holmes inclined his head. Someone he suspected? Someone he hoped to confront privately? He may have brought the key as proof, evidence of what he'd found. The chest was more than just a relic. It held the very thread of a lie stretching back generations, and he was going to pull it. But who would he have suspected if not Genevieve? Victor? Possibly. But there is one other person who had access to the key. I blinked. Beatrice? Holmes did not reply at once. Instead, he reached into his satchel and withdrew a small folded note, one I had not seen before. He handed it to me in silence. It read, L, if you have truly found what I think you have, then we must speak tonight. Not in anger, not in fear. You must hear what I know. 11 o'clock, the conservatory. Come alone. B. Good Lord, I breathed. Where did you find this? In the lining of Lionel's desk blotter. Miss Dunsmore allowed me access before we departed. I suspected he had received 2 notes that night, and this proves it. But why would he conceal it? Holmes's eyes were distant. Because he may not have known which note to trust, or because he suspected both. I stared at the note again, the handwriting slanted and elegant. But surely Beatrice isn't a murderer? Holmes finished. No, I do not believe she wielded the knife, but she was not uninvolved. Our train had just then begun to slow for a crossing, and Holmes stood, gathering his coat. Come, Watson, There is one more visit we must make. It was 3 days later when we found ourselves once more in the study of Inspector Lestrade, who had summoned us to Scotland Yard with the unmistakable tone of a man burdened with new developments. "I've had the coroner's report," he said, waving a sheaf of papers. "You'll want to hear it." Holmes seated himself with an air of polite anticipation while I took my place beside him. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Sir Lionel was not stabbed through the heart, as we first thought?" Holmes blinked. "No?" "No," Lestrade said, tapping the report. "The wound was deep, yes, but angled, strangely upward and slightly to the left. Not the angle of an assailant striking from the front, but rather someone who caught him by surprise. More interestingly, there was bruising on the back of his skull." "A blow before the knife," Holmes murmured. "Precisely. He may have been stunned first, perhaps knocked against the tile floor, and then stabbed while still dazed. There were no defensive wounds, no struggle. Someone he didn't fear." Holmes said nothing. He rose, walked to the window, and stared out into the grey light beyond. Lestrade gave me a look. "Is he always like this?" "More or less," I said, dryly. Holmes turned suddenly. "Lestrade, did anyone dust the knife handle for prints?" "None discernible. Wiped clean." Holmes nodded. "And Victor?" "Still in custody. He insists he was framed, says he never forged a letter, and never entered the conservatory that night." Holmes smiled faintly. "And what does Miss Dunsmore say?" "She hasn't said anything. Gone rather quiet since we left." Holmes gathered his coat again. "Come, Watson. One final call to Dunsmore Hall." Beatrice was in the garden when we arrived, seated on a stone bench near the frost-bitten remains of the rose-beds. She stood as we approached, wearing a coat too light for the weather, but she showed no signs of discomfort. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "I thought the case was over." "It may be," Holmes said, "but I'd like you to confirm one thing for me." She nodded. "You sent a note to your brother that night, asking him to meet you in the conservatory." Her eyes did not waver. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I thought he had found the truth. I wanted to speak with him calmly, away from the others. I feared what he might do if he acted in haste." "And when you went to meet him?" "I was too late," she said, her voice dropping. "I found him already lying there, his eyes open as though he were still waiting. Her voice caught. "I was terrified. I ran. I said nothing." Holmes was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you, Miss Dunsmore, but someone else was already there when you arrived, someone who had not left." Beatrice's gaze flickered. "I thought I saw something," she whispered. "A shadow, movement behind the glass, but I told myself I imagined it." Holmes exhaled slowly. "You didn't." He knelt and, from his coat, withdrew something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her gently. She unwrapped it and gasped. It was the brooch, the crimson button, set in gold, with her initials delicately etched in the filigree on the back, B.D. "Your brother had this made for you, didn't he?" Holmes said. She nodded slowly. "On my 21st birthday. I wore it often." "And you lost it?" "About a week before his death. I thought I had misplaced it." "You didn't," Holmes said gently. "Someone took it. Someone who wished to frame Victor. Someone who had access to your belongings, and who knew where your brother would go." Her voice came out in a whisper. "Merton." Holmes nodded. "The butler of 31 years, a silent witness to every family secret. A man who knew the servant tunnels, who could move unseen, who would not be questioned, who had served Charles Vernon Dunsmore, and who had sworn to protect his legacy." Tears welled in her eyes. "He killed Lionel? To preserve the past, to protect your father's name, perhaps even out of some twisted loyalty to the family line. When he learned Lionel had found the chest, he acted. I added he used the passage to avoid detection, struck Lionel down, and then arranged the scene, planting the button in your brother's hand to mislead Holmes and the police. Holmes stood. He believed Victor would make the perfect scapegoat. He had motive, temperament, and opportunity. It was elegant in its way. "And you knew?" Beatrice asked. "I suspected," Holmes said, "but I needed your truth to confirm it." Later that evening, Merton was arrested quietly, without incident. He did not confess, but neither did he protest. He simply bowed and said, "I did what was necessary." In the carriage home, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. The lamps of the city twinkled ahead as we approached London. "You were right," I said. "The case wasn't finished." He nodded, staring out the window. "No, Watson. Sometimes the shadows lie deepest, not behind the guilty, but beside the loyal." And with that, he closed his eyes and said no more. The wind had turned colder by the time we reached Baker Street the next morning, its bite sharpening as we stepped down from the cab. I noticed Holmes drew his coat tighter about him, not because of the chill. He rarely acknowledged the weather, but as though warding off the weight of the case still coiled around him. We had closed it, in a legal sense. Merton was in custody, the final piece of the puzzle apparently placed. And yet, I knew from long acquaintance that Holmes was unsettled. He made no remark as Mrs. Hudson welcomed us back with her usual bustling warmth. She brought tea, which Holmes ignored, and fresh newspapers, which he barely glanced at. He stood at the hearth for nearly an hour without speaking, staring into the fire as though hoping it would cast light on a question still burning behind his eyes. I waited as long as I could bear it before finally breaking the silence. "Holmes," I said, setting down my untouched cup. "You have that look again?" He did not turn. "What look, Watson?" "The one that says the case is not truly finished, no matter how neat the constables find the paperwork." He gave a soft, dry laugh. "My dear fellow, you have grown positively observant." I leaned forward. "You still have doubts?" "Not doubts, a whisper perhaps, something faint and wrong." "About Merton?" Holmes turned then, slowly, and met my gaze. "Merton is guilty, yes. He struck the blow, he arranged the scene, and he sought to mislead us, but I cannot credit him with the decision to kill. Not entirely." I frowned. "You think he was acting on someone else's orders?" "No, not orders." He moved to his desk and plucked the crimson button from the velvet pouch. It glinted in the grey morning light. "I believe he acted from belief, loyalty, as we said. But belief is rarely born in isolation. It is fed." He tossed the button gently into the air and caught it. Someone fed that belief. Someone whispered to him that Lionel was dangerous, disloyal, a threat to the family's very fabric. And Merton, dutiful man that he was, believed it. I sat back slowly. "But who? Victor is in custody. Genevieve confessed to manipulating the scene. Beatrice told the truth." Holmes gave me a long look. "Did she?" I started. "You think she lied?" "I think she omitted." He walked to the window, his silhouette outlined against the dirty light beyond. "When I asked Beatrice if she had sent that second note, she confessed. But did you notice, Watson, how swiftly she did so? As if she had been waiting for the opportunity." I said nothing. "She told us she found Lionel already dead, that she panicked and fled. She claimed to see a shadow beyond the glass, and I believed her because it fit. But perhaps it fit too well." "You think she was the one Lionel expected?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, not Genevieve, not Victor, Beatrice." He returned to his chair, folded his hands, and spoke quietly. Think, Watson. Lionel discovers the old agreement. He sees that his family's honour has been compromised by a decades-old bargain. He finds the chest, and he hides the key. I interrupted, but Beatrice found the key and brought it to us. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Or she planted it, Watson, to support her narrative. I stared. You think she orchestrated the entire confession? No, not orchestrated, but curated. She admitted just enough to appear brave, grieving, loyal. But what if she had known about the arrangement all along? What if she feared that Lionel would go public, and in doing so destroy not only their father's memory, but the family's financial future? She doesn't inherit the estate, I pointed out. No, Holmes agreed, but she inherits the legacy, the name, the standing, the quiet power that comes with being the last Dunsmore still standing. He rose suddenly and began pacing. And perhaps Merton, loyal, aging, dangerously sentimental, shared her view. Perhaps she did not tell him to kill, but suggested, perhaps tearfully, that Lionel was going to ruin everything. Perhaps she even asked him to stop him from making a terrible mistake. You're suggesting she manipulated him. I'm suggesting she gave him just enough truth to feed a lie, and Merton, filled with dread
and reverence, acted. I sat back heavily. But it cannot be proved. Holmes smiled faintly. No, it cannot. Which is why Scotland Yard will close the case. He turned back toward the window, the fire casting shadows along the carpet behind him. And yet, he added, almost to himself, it is not my business to prove the law's burden, only to see the shape of the truth. 2 weeks passed. The newspapers quickly moved on from the Dunsmore scandal, distracted by a jewel theft in Kensington and a diplomatic spat in Brussels. Holmes received a letter from Lestrade, brief and confident, confirming Merton's trial date and the satisfaction of the Crown Prosecution Service. Yet I noticed Holmes returned to his violin more often, especially at night. Not with his usual careless flourishes, but in the long, slow tones of Bach's partitas, as though drawing out a confession from the silence. And then, one morning, a letter arrived in an envelope sealed with green wax. Holmes opened it, read, and handed it silently to me. It was from Beatrice Dunsmore. Mr. Holmes, I write to thank you again for your efforts on our behalf. Dunsmore Hall has grown quieter, the gardeners have returned, the staff are slowly recovering from the upheaval. I intend to remain here, though I expect it will never quite feel the same. The past has settled back into the soil. You were kind not to question me more harshly. I think you suspected more than you said. Perhaps you understood that grief and guilt often speak with the same voice. I cannot tell you which guided me more that night or in the days that followed, but I can tell you that I will live with the consequences. Please do not visit again. Respectfully, Beatrice Dunsmore. I looked up slowly. Holmes's face was unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. She knew you knew, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. She also knew it could never be proven. No witnesses, no direct evidence, merely the shape of things. I folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. And will you honour her request? Holmes's eyes closed briefly. I already have. We said little else that day. The case, like many before it, faded into the background of Holmes's strange and restless mind. He turned his attention to a missing clerk in Limehouse, and later to a counterfeit operation in 7 Dials. But I found my own thoughts drifting back to Dunsmore Hall, to the quiet strength of Beatrice Dunsmore, to her carefully chosen silences and her tightly controlled grief. Merton would hang, I knew, and Beatrice would remain, elegant, composed, and untouched. And yet I could not shake the sense that the real inheritance of the Dunsmore name was not in land or title, but in the precision with which secrets were kept. As I wrote up my account of the affair, I ended it thus. Some crimes are committed with a weapon, others with a whisper, and the dead do not always carry the deepest guilt. A chill mist
hung low over the Thames that morning, curling around chimneys and cobblestones alike, lending London the air of a city between two worlds, one visible, one obscured. In our sitting room at Baker Street, the lamps were lit early against the gloom, and Holmes sat as still as a statue in his chair by the fire, one long finger resting against his temple. The case of the Dunsmore affair had, by all external appearances, concluded. Scotland Yard was satisfied. The newspapers had shifted their attention, and even I, despite lingering thoughts, had nearly laid down my pen on the matter. But Holmes had not. It was nearing 9:30 when a knock interrupted the hush. Mrs. Hudson opened the door to admit a boy in a coal-smudged cap. He handed Holmes a folded note, nodded, and disappeared down the stairs before I could even rise from my chair. Holmes unfolded the paper and read it silently. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "Well?" I prompted, after a moment's wait proved too long. He handed the note to me without comment. It was unsigned, and the handwriting unfamiliar. "There is a detail you missed. The red thread runs deeper than you think. Ask yourself, why did Beatrice know about the key before you did? Why did Lionel never mention her once in his final letters? Truth, when buried, grows roots. A friend." I looked up sharply. "Another anonymous correspondent?" "Not anonymous," Holmes said, rising. "Merely unnamed." "You think you know who sent it?" "I know who could have sent it, and if they did, the case is not only unfinished, but far more entangled than I suspected." He paced once, then turned to the door. "Come, Watson, I believe it is time we paid a call on the solicitor." "Which one?" "The man Lionel Dunsmore trusted with his final legal affairs, Mr. Archibald Pelling." We found Mr. Pelling at his office off Chancery Lane, a small, dimly lit room smelling faintly of lemon polish and old ink. He was a grey-haired man with cautious eyes and a perpetually pursed mouth, who seemed to regard every question as a potential trap. "Sir Lionel engaged me," he said after some initial pleasantries, "for the purpose of rewriting his will. He wished to make certain changes regarding the estate at Chilcombe Moor." "Did those changes include disinheritance?" Holmes asked. Pelling's brows rose a fraction. "He did not use that word, but he did indicate an intent to transfer ownership to an independent trust, one that would preserve the land and documents without benefit to his cousin or heirs." "Did he mention Beatrice Dunsmore in this matter?" Pelling hesitated. "Not in any specific clause. In fact, he seemed to go out of his way to avoid the topic of his sister." Holmes leaned forward. "Why?" "I could not say, but it struck me as unusual. He was a precise man, Sir Lionel, meticulous. And yet in our meetings he mentioned only Victor by name, and only to discuss his dissatisfaction. Did you retain a copy of the will?" Pelling inclined his head. "It had not yet been signed. Sir Lionel postponed our final meeting. The documents remain here." Holmes gestured. "May I?" The solicitor produced a slim file and handed it over. Holmes leafed through the pages quickly, then tapped a line with his finger. "There, to be held in trust by the Society for Historical Integrity. A clear intention to preserve the family's secrets without granting them power." He stood. "Thank you, Mr. Pelling. You have clarified much." As we stepped outside, Holmes glanced back toward the office. "He was cutting them off, Watson, not just Victor, but Beatrice too." "But why Beatrice? She remained loyal. She defended him publicly." "Ah, precisely," Holmes interrupted. "Too publicly, too swiftly, as if she already knew what she needed to protect." We had reached the edge of Lincoln's Inn Fields when he stopped abruptly, his gaze turning inward. "She knew about the key," he said softly, "before we found the chest, before anyone mentioned it. She produced it with a dramatic flourish, but that was no discovery, that was staging." He turned to me. "Why did Lionel hide the key in the lining of his coat? Because he didn't trust anyone, because he feared even his own sister." "And yet," I said slowly, "he agreed to meet her." Holmes nodded. He may have wanted to confront her, to see how far her silence went. And instead, he met Merton, who was not acting alone, Holmes finished. "Of that I am now certain." That evening, we returned once more to Dunsmore Hall. The butler was gone. A new maid answered the door, startled but obedient. Beatrice received us in the drawing-room, her posture flawless, her morning dress crisp. If she was surprised to see us again, she gave no sign. "Mr. Holmes," she said coolly. "Dr. Watson, I did not expect your return." Holmes bowed. "Miss Dunsmore, I hope we are not intruding, but there is a matter that requires clarity. I thought it best to inquire directly." "Of course." Holmes stepped forward and produced the note we'd received that morning. He held it gently between two fingers. "I believe you wrote this." Beatrice looked at it without blinking. "Why would I send such a note, and to what end?" "To cast doubt," Holmes said. "But not to deceive me, to mislead the public, to give the illusion of transparency while ensuring the real matter remains undisturbed." "I don't follow." "You've played your part well," Holmes said, not unkindly. "A grieving sister, a loyal defender, but it doesn't add up. You knew about the key, you withheld your brother's correspondence, and you steered our investigation subtly toward Victor, ensuring that when the truth emerged, it would be cloaked in family honor." Beatrice's expression did not change. "And what precisely do you accuse?"
"Me of? Of nothing the law would care to prove," Holmes replied. "But I believe you manipulated Merton. You gave him cause, perhaps even permission. You did not kill Lionel with your hands, but with your silence." A long pause followed. The clock ticked on the mantel. A log shifted in the hearth. Then Beatrice spoke. "I did what I thought best. Lionel was going to destroy everything, not only the family's standing, but its soul. Do you know what it would have meant if that agreement became public? The shame?" "The truth," Holmes said quietly. She rose slowly. "The truth is not always what we need. Sometimes it is a luxury we cannot afford." Holmes nodded once. "And Merton?" "I told him nothing," she said. "But I knew he listened, and I let him." She moved to the window and stood there, staring out across the lawn where the roses had been cut back for winter. "You cannot prove I intended anything," she said without turning. "No," Holmes agreed. "But I can ensure the rest of the truth is recorded." She turned to face him. "You intend to publish?" "Watson keeps an account. He always does. One day the full story will be told." She smiled faintly. "Then I suppose history will decide who was wrong." Holmes gave a short bow. "It usually does." We left Dunsmore Hall for the last time under a sky darkening with snow. As we stepped into the carriage, I turned once to look back at the tall windows of the drawing-room. Beatrice still stood there, framed in glass, a lone figure poised like a portrait in a family gallery, already fading into myth. "She admitted nothing," I said. "She admitted everything," Holmes murmured. "Just not to the law." We rode in silence for some time. Then I asked, "Do you think she'll live with it?" Holmes lit his pipe. "Guilt is a curious companion, Watson. Some people wear it lightly, others—" He exhaled a long ribbon of smoke. "Others build their lives around it." As we approached London, the lamps of the city flared to life like stars through the mist. and behind us, Dunsmore Hall vanished once more into the fog.
London was steeped in sleet and soot as we returned to Baker Street for what Holmes declared would be the final time concerning the Dunsmore affair. The long grey case, as I had come to call it in my notes, had extended far beyond our original expectations, deeper than inheritance, more complex than a simple crime of opportunity. And yet, as Holmes hung his damp coat by the fire and stirred his pipe bowl with a match, I could see he remained tethered to some lingering unease. The facts had been unearthed, the actors exposed, but the aftermath, quiet, weighty, human, refused to settle. He stood now by the window, hands behind his back, watching the fog cling to the panes. "You've been unusually quiet, Holmes," I ventured, seating myself and pulling my notebook closer. "I had rather thought, now that the matter has run its course, you'd be more inclined to speak." "On the contrary," he replied, "it is because the matter has run its course that I am less inclined to speak. What more is there to say?" "Much, I think, especially if your conscience is still pacing." He turned then, his expression unreadable. "Watson, do you know the sensation of having all the pieces of a puzzle in your hand, and yet finding that the picture it forms is not quite the one you anticipated?" "I do," I said carefully, though in this instance I thought the image had grown quite clear. He moved away from the window and took his seat, his lean fingers steepling. I believed so too. But clarity, like guilt, often resides in the interpretation. I closed my notebook and waited. He continued, "We have no doubt as to the action taken. Merton killed Sir Lionel. We understand the chain of events, the motives at play, the manipulation that led him there. But what remains unresolved is the extent to which those motives were freely adopted or planted. You still believe Beatrice Dunsmore bears the deeper responsibility?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Not because she intended murder, but because she cultivated the circumstances in which it became possible. She directed the narrative, shaped the responses, ensured that each subtle nudge appeared natural. Her hands remained clean, but her mind was the lever." "But you won't act?" He glanced at me. "And what action would you advise?" I hesitated. "None that would not collapse for lack of legal substance." "Just so," he said. "This is one of those rare cases, Watson, where the conclusion must be moral rather than judicial." He leaned forward. "Do you recall the terms of the unsigned will?" "Yes." Lionel had arranged to place the Chilcombe Moor estate in trust, an act which would have severed his family's ability to profit from it. "Exactly, and had that will been signed, the entire edifice would have collapsed. Victor disinherited, Beatrice disgraced by association, the family name, once so carefully preserved, reduced to a footnote in a minor scandal." Holmes stood once more and returned to the fire. "And so a man died to protect a legacy." I let silence stretch between us, broken only by the faint hiss of coals and the ticking of the clock. "But Holmes," I said finally, "you did preserve the truth. You uncovered it. You even allowed Beatrice to confess in her way." "True," he said, not looking at me. "And yet I wonder whether we solved a case or merely exposed a tragedy." He took up his violin from its corner and began to tune it with quiet deliberation. "Let us speak no more of it, Watson. I believe our next visitor will arrive within the hour." That visitor came in the form of a slight man in his 50s with a banker's posture and a solicitor's habit of avoiding direct statements. He introduced himself as Mr. Lionel Godfrey, executor of a minor trust associated with Chilcombe Moor. His manner was reserved, but Holmes received him with an unusual formality. "I understand," Mr. Godfrey said, "that you were involved in the late Sir Lionel Dunsmore's final affairs. In a manner of speaking, Holmes replied. What is your concern, sir? Godfrey adjusted his spectacles. There have been unusual inquiries regarding the estate. A letter was received by the Society for Historical Integrity, unsigned, claiming to possess documents related to a previous version of the Chilcombe land agreement. It was accompanied by a ledger copied in precise detail, referencing an appendix to the Martin Compromise, something neither the Society nor our office has on record. Holmes's brow arched slightly. And you believe the documents to be authentic? Regrettably, yes. They match the descriptions of lost correspondence thought destroyed in the fire of 1878. If true, they confirm that the estate was held under false pretense for nearly 50 years. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. And what has become of the letter? It was passed to our legal advisers, anonymously delivered. We have reason to believe the sender wished it to be discovered quietly. Holmes folded his arms. I see. Then the matter of justice may yet outlive the matter of law. The man gave a puzzled smile. If I may, sir, that's rather a cryptic way to phrase it. Holmes did not elaborate. After Godfrey departed, he sat back in his chair, lost in thought. She sent the papers, I said after a pause. Yes, Holmes murmured. Beatrice has given the truth to history, not through confession, through curation. She preserved the Dunsmore name while also correcting it. She found a way to do both, Holmes said. Lionel's wish has been honoured, quietly, posthumously, but not without cost. Victor is disgraced, Merton condemned, and she has severed her own path forward from the legacy she once swore to protect. I exhaled slowly. Then perhaps she's done penance. Holmes looked at me with something unreadable behind his gaze. No, Watson, she's done something harder. She's told the truth after ensuring it would no longer serve her. The days that followed were strangely peaceful. Holmes took up a new study of the mineral compositions of London's river mud, a topic I declined to follow, and I found myself reflecting often on the strange course of the Dunsmore affair. It had begun with a crimson button and ended with the quiet delivery of forgotten papers, and yet its true conclusion, I felt, resided not in courtrooms or newspapers, but in a hall of stone where legacy and loyalty had long outlived love. It was nearly a week later when I received one last letter, forwarded from the inn at Halberton, where we had first alighted on that misty night. The handwriting was unmistakable. Dr. Watson, I do not presume that you or Mr. Holmes require my thanks, but I give them anyway, for seeing the shape of things I could not admit. I have lost a brother, and though I tried to preserve something in his name, I see now it was never mine to protect. Tell Mr. Holmes that I returned the brooch to the chest. I believe it belongs with the others. Let it rest there. There will be no more whispers from Dunsmore Hall. B.D. I showed the letter to Holmes. He read it in silence, then handed it back. She means it, I said quietly. He nodded. She does. And then, as if to seal the matter at last, he struck a match and dropped the letter into the fire. We watched in silence as it curled to ash. The case of the crimson button, I would later record, was solved not by detection alone, but by the burden of memory and the final, painful honesty of those who survived. The morning that followed was quiet, save for the dull rumble of wheels on wet stone and the steady patter of rain on our windows at 221B Baker Street. London was in one of her reflective moods, fog-thick, bell-muted, and echoing with the whispers of the past. Holmes had not spoken much since the final letter from Beatrice Dunsmore had burned away in our hearth, but I knew his mind had not let go of the affair. It clung, like soot in the corners of the fireplace, a thing mostly purged, but never truly gone. I, too, found my thoughts drifting. Though the law had taken its due, and truth had risen in pieces from the ashes of misdirection and memory, there was no sense of triumph, only something quieter, sobering, human, unresolvable by verdict. I turned the pages of my notes from the affair, notations scribbled in haste during the train to Surrey, marginalia beside details from the conservatory, and a final underlined phrase from Holmes's lips. Some crimes are committed with a weapon, others with a whisper. There was no denying that this case had offered both. Holmes broke the silence first. "Tell me, Watson," he said from the settee without lifting his gaze from the ceiling, "what becomes of a truth once spoken, but to no audience?" I considered this. "I suppose it becomes a secret again." He nodded slightly. "Exactly. And yet a different kind of secret, one not of concealment but of futility, like a tree falling in a forest unheard." I closed my notebook and set it down. But this truth was heard. The solicitor now holds the documents. The Society for Historical Integrity will preserve them. The false legacy is undone. Beatrice Dunsmore has seen to that. Holmes sat forward, eyes sharp. Yes, and yet she remains untouched, untried, unnamed. She walks freely through the corridors of that house, having nudged a man to murder and preserved her name with sleight of narrative. "Would you rather she had hanged?" "No," he said flatly. "I do not seek punishment, Watson. I seek coherence. What troubles me still is not the absence of justice, but the completeness of her strategy. She saw the pieces far before us, anticipated how they might fall, and then gave us just enough to think we had solved it ourselves. She trusted you to see it in the end." "She trusted that I would be unable to act even if I did," he replied. That brought silence again. After some time, he reached for his violin and began to play, not the racing arpeggios of mental agitation, nor the long, mournful tones of meditation, but something gentler. A lullaby, almost. It struck me that he, too, was letting the case go, not by forgetfulness, but by ritual. And then the doorbell rang. Mrs. Hudson called from below. "A lady, Mr. Holmes, no name given." Holmes stood and set the violin aside. "Show her up," he called. Moments later, the door opened and a cloaked figure stepped into the room, rain beading on the shoulders of her coat. She removed her hat and veil slowly, and we saw her face, calm, composed, unmistakably familiar. "Genevieve Martin?" Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him. "Miss Martin. Or is it Mrs.? "Still Miss," she said with a weary smile, "though I doubt I'll carry the name much longer." Holmes gave a small bow and resumed his seat. "What brings you to us today?" "I've come," she said, "because I no longer know what to do with the truth." I glanced at Holmes, then leaned forward. "You have more to add?" She nodded slowly. "There is something I kept even from you, Mr. Holmes, something I had intended to bury. But after what you uncovered, after what Beatrice did, I see now that I must unearth it." Holmes said nothing, his gaze fixed. She reached into her handbag and produced a sealed envelope. "This," she said, "is a letter Sir Lionel wrote to me 3 days before his death. He left it in my room while I was out walking. I read it, and then I hid it." I took the letter and broke the seal. It was dated and written in Lionel Dunsmore's hand. The message was short, deliberate, and devastating. "Genevieve, I've seen the agreement. I know now what was traded. I cannot marry you, not because of your father's actions, but because I no longer believe either of us is free from the past. We are both heir to bargains we did not strike. I will not make your life one of scandal, and I cannot invite you into a house I now intend to expose. I suspect Victor already knows. Beatrice, I'm less certain, but I must act soon. Forgive me for loving you in a cage of secrets. Lionel, I read it twice before passing it to Holmes. Genevieve sat silently, her eyes lowered. I hid it, she repeated, because I thought it made me look weak, or complicit, or discarded. I don't know. I only knew that if Beatrice ever found it, she would use it. Holmes nodded once. You were right. She looked up. So, you see, Mr. Holmes, I did not merely stage the button in his hand to mislead you. I did it because I wanted the world to punish someone, anyone, before I let it punish me. Holmes folded the letter. The world will not punish you. No, she said bitterly, but it will forget me. That may be worse. He stood and handed the letter back. Miss Martin, you've carried your share of the crime, though it is not murder that stains your hands. It is silence and guilt worn like mourning silk. She said, What am I to do with this letter? Keep it, he said. One day, when the Dunsmore name is just an entry in an old ledger, and no one recalls the rest, it may remind you of the truth beneath the stories. She nodded, stood, and turned to go. But at the door she paused. There was one other thing, she said. Merton didn't act alone. I saw him, 2 nights before Lionel's death, speaking in hushed tones with Beatrice. Not in the hall or the garden, in the old east study behind the locked door. And what were they discussing? Holmes asked. I couldn't hear, but when I passed, they stopped speaking entirely, as if I had walked through a dream they were sharing. After she left, Holmes stood for a long time in the quiet. Then it is confirmed, he said at last. Beatrice did more than imply. She planned. But no one will believe it now. No, Holmes agreed, because there's no longer a reason to. Beatrice has given them their scapegoat, their truth, and their dignity. She's preserved the legacy by feeding it just enough blood. He turned back toward the window. She is the most dangerous kind of adversary, Watson, not the criminal who kills in passion, but the one who kills with poise and never touches the knife. And what becomes of her? Holmes was silent for a long time. She will fade, he said finally. Into history, into legend. Her version of the story will be told, repeated, perhaps even admired. And the truth? He looked at me. That, my dear Watson, will remain here, between us and the fire. I looked into the flames then, and saw in their flickering heart the shape of the crimson button, gleaming once more, resting not in a dead man's hand, but in memory. Forever waiting to be sewn into another tale. The lamps outside flickered against the advancing fog as night fell once more upon Baker Street. Within the sitting room, the fire burned low, casting long shadows over bookshelves and worn rugs, a warm cocoon that seemed almost reluctant to let go of the tale that had so recently consumed it. Holmes sat in his chair, hands clasped beneath his chin, the final wisps of smoke from his extinguished pipe curling like punctuation above his head. The Dunsmore affair, as I had begun to call it definitively, was over in every public sense. The newspapers had run their course, the solicitor had begun the long, tedious work of restructuring the Chilcombe Moor holdings, and Inspector Lestrade had returned to his usual grumbles about pickpockets and political agitators. Yet something in Holmes's stillness suggested that the true ending had not been for their benefit, but ours alone. I trust, he said at last, that your manuscript is nearly finished, Watson. I looked up from my notes. It is. Though I confess I've struggled with the final line. A story without a conclusion is like a chord unresolved, Holmes murmured. But you have all the pieces now, even the uncomfortable ones. Yes, I said, leaning back. Genevieve Martin's letter, her confession about the hidden note, her memory of Beatrice and Merton conspiring in that locked study. It closes the circle. Holmes nodded. Not with a clang, perhaps, but with a lock that slides gently into place. I looked over at him. It's difficult to know what to make of Beatrice Dunsmore. Holmes's lips curled faintly. She made herself difficult to grasp. That was the point. She planned it then, the whole arc, the silence, the redirection, the button. She created the illusion of cooperation, Holmes interrupted. She led us to Victor, not falsely. He was a participant, if only by prior knowledge and cowardice. But she framed the narrative so that Merton would take the brunt, Victor the disgrace, and she the mantle of mourning and reluctant witness. But Lionel saw through it, I said. Yes, Holmes agreed, and he died for it. He stood then, retrieving a small tin from the mantel. Inside, the crimson button lay alone, polished and solemn. I kept this, he said quietly, not as evidence, but as emblem. This case was never about property or documents or even murder, not truly. It was about legacy, what we pass on not through birthrights or estates, but through memory, through story. He turned the button between his fingers, then returned it to the tin. And Beatrice Dunsmore, I said, has preserved her version. For now, Holmes replied. But truth is patient. Like iron in the earth, it rusts slowly, but it remains. We were silent for a time. The fire crackled softly. I thought of Dunsmore Hall, of Lionel's cold body in the conservatory, of Victor's final cry as he was taken, of Merton's resigned silence at the gallows. I thought of Genevieve, who had finally chosen to speak, and of Beatrice, who had spoken only in the language of silence. Holmes finally turned to me. Will you publish it all, Watson? The full story? I met his eyes. No, I'll keep the conclusion to ourselves. The facts will stand, but the shape of it, some things are better understood in private. He nodded, pleased. You have grown wiser, my friend, he said. The truth need not always ring like a bell. Sometimes it is enough that it exists, that it was heard once. And with that, he turned back to the fire. I rose and went to the window. The street was nearly deserted. The city, soot-covered and spectral in the gaslight, carried on unknowing. Somewhere in Surrey, Dunsmore Hall slept beneath the weight of its history, walls intact, names remembered, silences preserved. But I knew what had been uncovered there. I had seen it in the scuffed tiles, the faded letters, the crimson trace in a dead man's hand. And I knew, as surely as I knew Holmes's brilliance or the steady ache of a mystery solved too late, that justice had not worn its usual robe this time. It had whispered, shifted, passed, like mist through an open window. Still it had come. I turned from the glass and took up my pen once more. The case of the crimson button is closed, but in the quiet places of memory it lingers still. Dr. John H. Watson. And so I ended the tale,